We read a shocking story. And it's even more poignant, the fact that a child read the story. How could we destroy the whole Christmas story with the killing of the children? What has that got to do with it? I know that when others have read this story, that bit they just leave out of the middle. Because what is that all about? Why would we want to remember this part of the story, what Herod did to destroy the Christ child? In Matthew's Gospel, the key message is his name and the assertion that Emmanuel means God with us. So what's this got to do with God with us? How could this story have anything to do with it? This is not God's will. The killing of the children is never God's will. Some people, using an Old Testament perspective on life, believe that God is in charge of everything that ever happens to humanity. This story illustrates to me that God is not in charge of everything that happens within humanity. God never ordained this, nor did he permit this. It just is the result of human terrorism and evil. It's a terrible story. It is not what God wanted for the Christ child, nor for the children who died because he had been there. But we continue to assert that God is with us. And we have enough in the story to prove our point. God is with the Magi. From the beginning to the end. God comes to the Magi in the shape of a star. And the Magi see the star, and because of their culture and their understanding and their education and their way of seeing the world, they see a prophecy. They see the promise of the Son of God, or the Messiah of Israel, fulfilled. And so what do? They get on Shank's pony or a donkey or on a camel or whatever they travelled on, because we don't know. And they travel from wherever they live to where? To Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, they looked for more direction. And direction came to them from the Old Testament scriptures. And you, Bethlehem, in land of Judah, and all that, how way that goes. And so they got direction from the scriptures in Herod's court. And what did they do? They obeyed the direction. And they went and they found Jesus. And I can see a little process developing here. These people were Gentiles. They were people that were not expected to be part of the story. Foreshadowing the fact that Jesus' message would go eventually to the Gentiles. Even in Matthew, whose primary concern is to show us that Jesus is the Messiah of Israel. But still he includes this story showing us that the Messiah, who is the King of Israel, also has a message for all of us who are Gentiles. A little process is developed there where they got a communication from God through a star or through a scripture. They obeyed. They followed the message that they were given. and they saw a promise fulfilled. A prophecy fulfilled. They saw, you see how Matthew does that? He says, he always refers back, and so was fulfilled the prophecy that said. And so we have the beginning of an understanding that here is God with the Magi who are finding the Christ child. God is with Joseph in his family. Again, you see the dream comes. The angel comes to Joseph in a dream, just as the angel came to Joseph in Matthew's Gospel, comes to Joseph to tell him about the birth of the child. The angel comes now again to warn him to go. Get out of here. There's a communication. And what does Joseph do? He obeys. Maybe we'll get them. He obeys. And so is fulfilled a prophecy, which flows from the fact that when, again, in Egypt, the prophecy is that my child will be brought out of Egypt, or some words like that. And then in Egypt, again, a communication. Herod has died. You can return now. So what does Joseph do? He obeys. And he goes back to Israel. But he doesn't want to go back to Bethlehem, where the children have been killed. Archelaus is now king. And he's not much better than Herod. So he decides that he will go and live in Nazareth, where Luke always thought they lived. But the prophecy fulfilled? Because he will be called a Nazarene. That's not quite what a Nazarene means. A Nazarene is a particular type of believer, a particular group within Israel, not necessarily related to where you live, but, well, that's a quirk of Matthew. The process has begun. God is with us in the journey as it goes. You'll notice that God doesn't remove their troubles. He just goes on the journey through them with him. So he's with them in the journey of troubles. God doesn't stop things happening. In some ways, I'm not sure that God can stop things happening. Is that heresy? Maybe it is. But God is always with his people in the troubles, but also in the joys. And he communicates with them. And as they're obedient, so they find the promise fulfilled. God was with Israel right from the beginning. Remember, Joseph got sold into slavery by his brothers, would you believe? He was sent off to Egypt as a slave by his brothers. But God communicated with Joseph, and Joseph obeyed God, and Joseph became a ruler in Egypt. This is the story. And then Israel comes to Egypt in the famine, and they find home and hope and a place to survive in Egypt, where they live for 400 years and become slaves themselves. And then God sends Moses, who's reluctant to go, but he goes anyway because he has a communication through this beautiful bush. And in his obedience, so the promise is fulfilled, and they all return from Egypt. Communication, obedience, and the promise fulfilled. In our story, Jesus becomes a reminder of that whole journey of Israel. Jesus encapsulates this Exodus story within his own life, because he too goes to Egypt for safety and finds safety there, and God brings him back out of Egypt and settles him new in the promised land. It's the same story. And the whole idea is that identifies that the God who is with Israel is the God who is with Jesus and his family, is the God who is with the Magi, who is the God who is with all of us. This is all part of our salvation story. We began somewhere. We had some level of communication with God. And I'm amazed sometimes the stories people tell. I haven't seen any angels. And my dreams aren't very colourful. But God seems to communicate to us and to me in ways that I don't quite understand. Through my thought processes, through the relationships that I have with you and others, through my experiences and the way that I feel guided, through the call that I feel to do what I'm doing today. And the only way of hope is to take the next step of obedience. And this is why you're here. Because some experience happened, you were obedient to that experience, and you've experienced the love of God and the promise of salvation. It's an ongoing story. It's a journey. It's a simple process that all of us are part of. Where is God in the story? God is with all the people, but particularly with the children who died. God is with those families. God is with the people because of what Jesus did. We know this. Because Jesus hung about with that sort of people, those sorts of people. The people who were distressed, the people who were poor, the people who were handicapped, the people who were struggling with life, the people who were not mentally right. They're the people who took special note of, even in Matthew's Gospel. And so I have a picture here of going back quite a long time, back in those days when we had asylum seekers coming to Australia, and this boat was approaching Christmas Island, and within a few minutes after that, it was matchstick wood. It crashed into those rocks, and the people on that boat died. And we used that as a reason or an excuse to create a policy which tormented those sorts of people for the next 10 years. Because, of course, we don't want to see that sort of thing happen again. We don't want to see people dying because they crash into rocks near Christmas Island. So we better make sure they don't ever come here again. We better make sure they stay where they belong, over there. God was with the children who died on that boat. This is a picture of a child who's a child slave carrying rocks for some lord or master or parent who's abusing the child. God is with the child. He's not, it's the parent or the terrorist or the terrible person who's made this child a slave, who is not with God. This child belongs in school. This child belongs in a happy family with loving parents who hug him and kiss him and make him feel like he belongs and is valuable in the world. This is a famous picture of a child crawling to a United Nations relief station. This is a little girl. The journalist who took it, you see the vulture in the background, waiting for the child to die. She's a kilometre away from the station. The journalist took the photo and left. I might add, for all sorts of reasons that I won't go into, and I read a bit of this story, this journalist also committed suicide a little later. There were those who said he should have picked up the child and carried it to the station. But his job was to take photographs. God is with the oppressed. God is with that child. Here's a cartoon that Nicholson wrote way back in the day, and I can't read it from there, so I'll just turn it around. It's not very clear. Back in 2001. This is Mary and Joseph and the baby going somewhere. And the cartoon says, Christmas Island sounded good, but we'll settle for Egypt after all. Jesus was a refugee. Do we ever miss that? Do we ever understand that? Jesus went to Egypt as a refugee for asylum's sake. And ancient Egypt offered Jesus asylum. He wasn't taken into custody. He wasn't put in a prison with a different name. He was treated with, well, acceptance at least. And he was allowed to go home when the time came. Herod is not with God. I'm not prepared to say that any of those tyrants that God is not with them. Because I think God is with them, challenging them all the way down the track. But Herod is not with God when he seeks to kill the children. Herod is not with Putin when he seeks to bomb what's the place? Ukraine. Thank you. Ukraine from existence. Herod is not on the side of what God is on about at this point in time. He's already killed half of his family who were a threat to him, who he thought would take his throne. How do you expect him to behave when somebody comes along and says, we know of this baby king who's going to take your throne? Well, he'll do his best to get rid of that one before he gets a chance to grow up. Whether he understood or misunderstood. I have a saying. I'm responsible for this saying, nobody else. When a person feels threatened, confronted or attacked head on, that person will defend themselves to the extremity of the power available to them. And very often when they're saints too. When you think about it, when people are threatened, they defend. Herod is defending his territory at a base level. I've seen it happen, that principle, I've seen that happen by elders in churches. I've seen that happen by some of the most respected and nice people I've ever known. In fact, I think I've done this myself. Defended myself to whatever power. Well, one little story about that, as a child at least. I was defending, in this case, I think, my pride. We were doing, you already know some of my educational history, and I'm not sure I should go there, but whatever. We were doing mental arithmetic, and I think I was in grade 2. And we had, this is in Queensland, we had slates and slate pencils. That's how old I am. And the teacher asked questions and we wrote them on the slate, the answers on the slate. And then we swapped slates and our partner answered it. Well, I wasn't very good at maths, never was, not even then. So I made a deal with the guy next to me. I said, you give me 9, I'll give you 10. And this went on for some days. And my parents had a parent-teacher interview in that period of time, and the teacher told my parents how much better I was doing at maths recently. And then she asked to look at my slate. I got 3 out of 10 on that day. And I got the ruler across my knuckles, and I got to stand facing the blackboard for some time on that day. I was seeking to defend something, and the only power I had to do that was to cheat. And so I cheated. A basic human trait, cheating. So Herod is very human. My point is that what Herod is doing here, while it's extreme, is not beyond the possibility of anybody who's human, who have something to defend. Lots of people in our culture defend their wealth to the power available to them. Lots of people defend their status to the power available to them. Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us all. God is with us. Remember this saying I had with you? The Spirit of God is amongst the people of God. The Spirit of God is always present. So the Spirit of God, God is with Noarlunga Centre Church of Christ. He's with you. You've got a journey going on. A journey about ministry. A journey about the future. A journey about how we approach 2023 and 2024 and 2025. How are we going to fulfill the mission of Jesus? We've heard a communication. God has called us to serve him in this place. This was heard some years ago when we talked about building a building here, eh, Peter? And it's continued ever since. Noarlunga Centre Church of Christ is called to be obedient to that call. But how? We need a new method, we need a new way of thinking, and we need to go back to basics. And I think I was trying to talk about that right at the beginning of my time with you. It's time to get back to basics of expressing the love of God, of supporting one another, of recognising the Spirit of God amongst us and ministering together. But be assured, God is with you in the journey. Won't take away the troubles. Won't take away the challenges. Won't take away the decisions. Won't suddenly do something miraculous necessarily that will change the world for you. He will call you to obedience. And in obedience, the promise will be fulfilled. We are called to be those to show God's love to those who Jesus cared about. And this church does that in some ways quite remarkably. You have a very diverse community. And that's a blessing. You've got people from all sorts of walks of life. And that's a wonderful nature of this community. You have arms that can reach into anywhere if you'll let those arms reach. So we have the opportunity to share the love of God with this whole community. And I think you did a bit of that last night, didn't you? You did a bit of that last night. That's what that was about. Sharing the love of God. Here's another mantra of mine. When it comes to the end, when I meet somebody, the question is not what does this person look like, or does this person fit within my frame of reference, or can I accept this person because of what they look like? How am I going to love this one? How am I going to love this one? whoever it is. God is with you in that journey and in that mission.